Welcome, everybody. Please, if you will take your seats, we will start the afternoon program. My name is Pamela All. I am the provost for the Academy for International Conflict Management and Peacebuilding here at USIP. And it is my very great pleasure this afternoon to be able to introduce Jan Eliasson, who will be speaking to us in a moment. Jan has gotten to that stage in life where people, when they introduce him, say he needs no introduction. But I'm not going to say that because it is very important to recognize the really extraordinary things that this man has done in life. He is now Deputy Secretary-General of the UN, but he has served at the UN on a number of occasions. He was Special Envoy of the Secretary-General for Darfur, and he was the first ever Undersecretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs in the early 1990s. He has also served in the Swedish government a number of positions, including foreign minister. But for those of us who live in Washington, the closest connection was when he served as ambassador of Sweden to Washington and participated in the programs of probably a lot of institutions here in this room. We fondly remember him here at USIP because he was an enthusiastic participant in all sorts of meetings, but as he says, his favorite one was the ones that we had on intractable conflicts. Somehow just, trying to figure out how to bring some sort of resolution to the most difficult conflicts in the world got him very excited. And he also was here as a senior fellow for too short a time, and perhaps when he finally decides to retire in 10 or 12 years, he might come back again. So with that, Jan, I'm going to turn the podium over to you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Pamela. You were part of that group of masochists who wanted to deal with intractable conflicts. And that reminds me of something that perhaps one or two of you experienced. I was offered a very nice farewell reception when I left my position as emergency relief coordinator in the 90s. It was after Somalia, some of the disasters, both of natural disasters and man-made disasters in the world. I had spent the time out there under rather heavy sacrifices personally and with health and others because it was really tough. But when I was introduced, I was given a very generous introduction. But the lady who asked me to come up to the podium slipped on the last line when she asked me to come up, because she said then, and now, ladies and gentlemen, let us meet Jan Eliasson. And by the way, you pronounce it perfectly with your Norwegian-Swedish background. Let us meet Jan Eliasson, the man responsible for all disasters in the world. That's the price I paid for having been emergency relief coordinator. For me, this is coming home. I've spent 9 years in Washington, D.C. as first secretary, as ambassador. By the way, I also graduated from American high school before I graduated in Sweden. I was an American field service student in Decatur, Indiana, many years ago. I won't say how many. Anyway, I've got a long background here, and to come down from New York to Washington is homecoming. And I thank you very much. Both you, Melanie Greenberg from the Alliance of Peacekeeping for Peacekeeping, and of course Pamela and George and others from U.S. Institute of Peace who have this wonderful building. And for me, this is a reminder of the free thinking and the atmosphere that I recall from the think tank discussions, not least on intractable conflicts. Before I start, my mother always says, speak about what your heart is full of. And I must, of course, tell you how deeply I feel with you on what happened in Boston yesterday. I walked through Penn State Station this morning, and I promise you that all of those who were gathering there in those central areas were thinking of what's next, and were thinking of what they had seen on the television screen yesterday and heard on the radio. And I just want to share with you my combination of dismay and sadness that we again are reminded of how people blindly believe in violence as a way of solving what they perceive as their problems, when in fact they just dig the enmities, the antagonism deeper and deeper. And where there is a systematic effort going on in this world by several groups and personalities, I'm sure, to spread fear. I will not pronounce myself of the character of what happened now. It is just blind violence, but it is evidently meant to spread fear. And there are few things that are so damaging in the world ever since 9/11 than the so-called fear factor, that you look over the shoulder and that you don't trust certain groups. You look at names and ethnic background and you divide humanity into us and them. And that's where we have to be careful not to fall in that trap. And never forget that if they win, if you get more scared. And that we have to maintain our societies as we dream of them and as we aspire to build them. And that means without fear. It's not easy when you are reminded of the power of that violence and the effects on them. But I just wanted to say to you how much I felt with you yesterday, and that this is unfortunately a universal phenomenon that we have to deal with. Let me then come back to the subject, which is the challenges for conflict resolution for the UN, but also I would say outside the UN, and the challenges for peace building today. What I would like to start with is just to give a little bit of the new environment, I would say the new world. It's probably a banality for a long time to say that we live in turbulent times. There are really new developments, but I think that we can really speak about a huge change of the conditions under which international diplomacy is conducted. And I feel that coming back to the United Nations, the Deputy Secretary-General, only comparing to my time as President of the General Assembly 7 years ago, Permanent Representative of Sweden 20 years ago, Undersecretary-General 18, whatever, it is a different world. In what respect is it different? Well, the first thing is, of course, to look at the new geopolitical, geo-economic map in the world. I won't go into detail because otherwise we will disappear into a 3-hour exercise here. But it's obvious you see the shift to Asia, of course, not only economically, but also growingly politically, both with good and bad elements. You see Korea recently, North Korea recently, but also you see the growth in Asia, which saves many of the market economies in the West. That is an obvious shift, and I would also add to that the emergence of emerging powers. I don't say emerging economies, that you would have said 5 years ago. I say emerging powers. Countries that are very impatient, very requiring space on the world stage, growing normally by anywhere between 5% and 12% per year, and with a tremendous self-confidence in what they are doing. I can only mention examples like India, Brazil, out of a few. You can, in another category, see countries like Turkey, Indonesia, coming in that category. South Africa in Africa, for instance. And these are two very important trends, the shift to the east, geopolitically, geoeconomically, and the emerging powers. And if you then move that into the United Nations and look at the composition of the Security Council, you can imagine the tensions and the expectations, not least from these emerging powers, to play the role that they think they deserve, both from the point of view of population and economic and political power. That's one change. Another one is, of course, the new, I would say new global challenges. Because when I look back at my diplomatic life, these new challenges did not exist these many years ago. The climate change, was not an issue, wasn't even mentioned until 1980. I think that's when it started to be discussed. It's a new issue. And of course, the fact that the environmental degradation in the world has reached critical points, that we actually see our own planetary boundaries. You know, sometimes in life you're asked when you have a good idea, I think you recall this, and people want to put you down a little bit, they say, well, that's fine, but what is your plan B? In other words, you will fail on plan A. But I give you a line that you can use on climate change and environmental degradation is, yes, I may have a plan B, but I certainly don't have a planet B. We don't have a planet B. So this is new. The fact that the condition of the planet is an existential issue for all of us is new. The mass migration is also new. We had, of course, migration, but nothing as compared to what it is today. And that is, of course, of tremendous significance economically, politically, socially, inside societies. The migration debate in practically every country is enormously sensitive, in which also political forces fish in rather murky waters. And now I speak about Europe, where I have my background. You have also the communication revolution. I was at a lunch recently where we talked about this, the enormous change that comes from the fact that knowledge is spread so much that nobody can hide anymore behind borders, except perhaps in North Korea, and that knowledge is in the hands, on the tip of the fingers of particularly a young generation. This is an enormously powerful new instrument, a new tool in the world. Politics also, and can never be disregarded. For everything we do to today's world, we need to have a communication strategy. Whatever you are involved in, remember, there has to be a communication strategy. Sometimes perceptions are as important as realities. I met a media professor in New York who told me that when I said this, perception are as important as realities, he said, you almost understand what it is in today's world. I thought I was pretty smart for saying that. No, he said, perceptions are realities. In other words, you need to make sure that you deal with the perception that they're as close as possible to the realities. So here are the huge global challenges, the new environment which is there. Maybe I could also add something which concerns me enormously, and that is the role of organized crime. The drug trade, a couple of $100 billion a year, illegal arms trade, $150 billion, prostitution, $100 billion, women and children are sold as merchandise, and people are actually working under slave-like conditions in the numbers of 10, 12, 15 million people. And this is a trade, and they don't tax their money. And that money plays a very important role, undermining institutions, in fact, I would say, risking to undermine democracy. And we need to look at that as a new threat in terms of the size and drama of that threat. I point to these global challenges to give you a little bit of the background. The last point is the growth and importance of non-state actors. This is also related to the ethnic and religious dimension that I mentioned briefly, that we tend to see conflicts not only in terms of state to state, state versus state, but also trends inside societies, inside nations, where ethnic belonging, religious belonging becomes a very important aspect of identity search for people, but also dangerously being used by ruthless leaders to bring the case that you cannot live together if you don't create your own state with only people from this ethnic or religious background. And that in turn, of course, strengthens this us and them syndrome, which is also so evident in today's world. And this is a new phenomenon which you see, which you saw, of course, during the Balkan War, where the ethnic and religious dimensions were, of course, crucial. And it also introduced a very strong emotional element. The conflict was not about borders. I negotiated between Iran and Iraq. In the end, it was about where the line was drawn in the Shatt al-Arab. But now, if it is about how to integrate as different groups, and where antagonism is grown by the propaganda and bringing in an emotional element, these conflicts are so much more difficult. And that is, of course, the plague of the civil wars that we have seen for some time, going up and down, mostly up to in the early 90s, down, but now there is a new trend again that this comes back, that these ethnic, religious factors come back into world politics. And this brings me to the challenges to conflict resolution, Melanie, what you wanted me to focus on. I would say this last point is one of the greatest challenges for the United Nations. The ambassador of Mali, who was at the lunch, are you here, ambassador, still? He's coming back. Anyway, his nation was just divided into two parts, one of them led by a group that claimed at the beginning ethnic identity, the Tuaregs, but then taken over, as you may know, from by extremist groups, I would say terrorist groups. And the nation divided in two, and one of them, the north, was as big as twice France, I think. And then, as you saw, the horrors with the destruction of the culture, of the Tuareg culture, the destruction of shrines in Timbuktu, as you recall, and then, of course, the horrible crimes committed against women, not least, but also with abhorrent punishment of crime, cut off hands and so forth. There was a strong reaction, and the international community, in this case France, at the invitation of the government of Mali, came, and now there is, of course, a situation where, again, the UN is asked to play a role. And here's a challenge. If you have a situation where the United Nations role could also be a role of peace enforcement, or even playing a role in combat situations, how do we then maintain the classic neutrality and impartiality of UN peacekeeping or UN presence? What happens if we get involved in the fighting, for which often we are not trained as peacekeepers? What effect does that have on the presence of our humanitarian workers, on the presence of human rights monitors, on the presence of our civilian staff in the different offices or functions that we exercise, UNICEF and others inside the country? Here is a great dilemma. And this has led us to a discussion in the UN whether in these situations we should have two tracks. One, if we can achieve that, a classic peacekeeping role, and the other one with a combat or a peace enforcement role, which is given to a specific group of countries or one country. In the case of Mali, there will probably be such a role played by France, even if the UN sets up a peacekeeping operation. In the case of Democratic Republic of Congo, there is a group which is called, put under the name Intervention Brigade, which should be at the side of the UN force and be able to also do more muscular operations, if I may say so. Here's a big dilemma, and that goes back to the fact that we now will deal with threats that are often called asymmetrical. In other words, you have a state on one side, and then you have groups that often apply terrorist methods on the other side. And this is the new environment in which we have to work. It's not the classic situation where you have a war and then a ceasefire and then we have to monitor the ceasefire line. It's a much more complicated situation. And what is at stake is how do we maintain the necessary neutrality and impartiality of the UN? That's one challenge. Now, what can we do? What direction can we go? I always want to try to be an idea, give some ideas of what we could do to not land in these situations as much as we seem now to do. Well, my first observation is that dealing with these combat situations, as I now see around me in the UN, I just mentioned a few of the conflicts, reminds me of the enormous importance of Chapter 6 of the UN Charter. I always carry the Charter in my pocket. Here it is. Chapter 6 of the UN Charter has a beautiful title, Pacific Settlement of Disputes. Not even peaceful, it's poetry. And Article 33 tells you what you should do before you use of force, which is Chapter 7. And here's what we should do before a conflict erupts. The parties to any dispute shall first of all seek a solution by, now count on your fingers, negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, resort to regional agencies or arrangements, or other peaceful means of their own choice. 8 different methods before things explode. How often do we do this? Very, very, very seldom. So there's a need, with this in combination with a prevention strategy that both Melanie and Pamela have worked on, is what is needed so that we get in earlier in the conflicts and avoid to land in these situations. The second formula that I have that I think needs to be applied for peace, both conflict resolution and peace building, Melanie in particular, think about our conversation, is that we need to have a holistic approach. We need to bring the different factors building peace together at the same time. When I was president of the General Assembly 2005 and 2006, we established a formula which I think says it all. There is no peace without development, but there is no development without peace. And there is no lasting peace or sustainable development without respect of human rights. I would today add rule of law. So peace, development, human rights is an agenda that we have to do at the same time. In the past, I remember discussions that first you get peace, then you do development, and then in the end you do human rights. It's absurd. These are 3 pillars. If one of these pillars is weak, and I saw it in Darfur, if one of these pillars is weak, the whole structure is weak. So any conflict resolution, any peace building has to take into account the need to look into both peace security aspects, development aspects, rule of law, and human rights. And that's a huge agenda. You need almost to be a Renaissance personality to do it, but we could use rather than this as a tool to break down walls between us so that we don't work in silence, but rather bring in the different elements, the expertise that is available to us. In the UN, when I now lead the discussions on post-Afghanistan, post-2014 in Afghanistan or Mali or Syria, even post-conflict there, I hope we'll reach that stage. I bring in not only the political side, but also the development side, the humanitarian side, and the human rights side. And we work on this together. And we hope that we will then have programs, packages together that then bring in that totality, that holistic approach to our work. And this also leads me to the third way we could go forward, and that is to bring in the new actors. UN can't do everything alone, of course. On the contrary, I become more and more modest about our own capabilities. We need to reach out to, in the international organization system, of course, World Bank. I'm going back here to Washington for the spring meeting of the World Bank on Thursday and Friday and this week. We need to, of course, connect with governments. We need to connect with civil society. We need to connect with the track 2 aspects. I see Bill Miller here, a great friend. The track 2 aspects, especially if you deal with these civil war situations or where ethnic and religious dimensions are involved, you need to bring in more unconventional actors. The academic world is another important actor. This means that there has to be some type of international division of labor, shared responsibility. Nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. And you should identify that particular role. It's also very good to fight this hopelessness that exists around global issues. So big, turn off the television, stop the world, I want to get off. If you sort of identify your thing that you can do as part of the whole, then you also have an effect, psychological effect on hopelessness and powerlessness, perhaps. Okay, challenges to peace building, finally. I was also involved in the Peace Building Commission, again, when I was President of the General Assembly, and Pim Walder, a colleague of mine, comes with me. I recruited you back in those years, and you worked with the peace building issue also. We established the Peace Building Commission in December 2005. It has had some successes, and there is still work to do on the peace building concept. It was a rather controversial concept because it was considered infringement of the role of the Security Council, that this Peacebuilding Commission was established as a link, as a bridge between General Assembly, all member states, ECOSOC, Limited for Economic and Social Affairs, and the Security Council. But I think it's a very important concept and has to be very much alive. And the main reason for me is that we have to make sure that we don't see a relapse of conflicts. This is one of the scariest parts of looking at the statistics of conflicts from the early 90s until now, is the degree to which conflicts erupt again. One of my best friends, and I served as visiting professor at Uppsala, and you were there at the conference, I remember, Pamela, is Peter Wallenstein of the Peace and Conflict Research Department of Uppsala. And Pim and I were in contact with him just before this conference here in Washington with you at Alliance for Peacebuilding. And we asked him, what is your latest figures? And I will now give you are the first ones to get the latest figures from Peter Wallenstein. This is news. This is news, I'll tell you, and this is extremely interesting. In the period 1990 to 99, almost 47% of all terminated conflicts restarted within 5 years. For those with negotiated settlement, this rate was 46%. While for those who ended with victory, the rate was almost 10%. That's bad news, but it will be better when I continue to read. This means that in this period, victories were more successful in ending armed conflict in the between 1990 and 1999. However, and these are the new figures, in the following period, 2000 to 2009, about 42% of all conflicts restarted, a little bit down from 47. Good news. But more importantly, victorious endings were no longer as successful. 40% of those restarted, and indeed, negotiated settlement only restarted in 21% of the cases. So it's reversed in this first decade of this century. And that is, of course, good news. So Peter ends, in short, lately, negotiated endings have been much more successful in actually ending armed conflict than victory. My interpretation of this is that negotiations have been better at ending conflicts in the past 10 years than previously, suggesting that these solutions simply are of better quality. The victories that most parties have as a first option turn out to be more difficult to achieve today than before. And this rings very true when I work with Syria right now. And then his last word, a statement in favor of mediation, I guess, exclamation point. Your friend, Peter Wallenstein. So I'm glad to give you this information, which is really based on very good research, as we all know, in Uppsala. Well, the conclusions is that we need to take this prevention approach, the peaceful settlement approach. We need to take the holistic approach. We need to understand that there has to be national ownership on all processes. To impose it from the outside is culturally difficult and also politically difficult. I've noticed more and more there has to be always a handover to national entities, in some cases even local entities. And then there is something which is absolutely vital for both peace and security to be established and also for development to have a lasting impact, and for human rights, of course, to take hold, is that there have to be strong institutions. Strong institutions are absolutely crucial for peace and security, development, and human rights. From my own country, I can tell you, Sweden was one of Europe's 3 poorest countries 80 years ago, and turned into one of the world's most prosperous countries already in the 60s. What happened in the meantime? Well, strong, healthy, honest, well-functioning institutions were established. A. B. Infrastructure was built. C. A fair and strong education system was gave all rights to all people to have free education, including university education, if you are prepared for that, if if you have the capacity and talent. This was the reason why this country turned from one of the poorest to one of the most prosperous in the world. My own family is part of this history. My mother had 4 years of school, and I grew up in one room. I'm the first one to have more than 7 years education in my family. And this shows that it is possible. But I attribute enormous importance to institutions and infrastructure and education. Of course, the challenge for us prosperous societies is, of course, if we're willing to pay for it. But that's something else, more of a political issue. I understand, in this city, also, a sensitive issue. So, I think this is where I could end, Melanie, and just to say that I want to commend you all who are in this room. The spring day, you could enjoy, see the green on the trees and be out there. Maybe the sun will appear and you have decided to be in this room. I want you to know that your work on peace building, on your work on making this world better, realizing what I said, hopefully, that nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something, is such an important wisdom to remember, that we all have an obligation. And to see you work with these issues in the most powerful country in the world, modern-day Rome, as I said at my farewell reception as ambassador here, is even more important. And I would say the more we can also build bridges between the United States and the world, which is also represented here in different forms, and the UN, the better. Because the UN is our common organization. If we were to abolish it, we would meet tomorrow and create a new one, probably on the same basis that the old one was built. The UN is not an ideal organization. We have many faults. We have many problems that we do not solve, like Syria, where we wait for action from the Security Council in particular. But that this is the organization that, after all, is a reflection of the world as it is, and not of the world as we want it to be. But I think our work for all of us is to try to bridge that gap, to make that gap less clear, less dramatic than it is today. We should try to diminish the difference between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And that is what could drive us. And I'm glad that the Alliance for Peacebuilding is playing that very important role in the Middle East. So I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jan, so much on behalf of our community and behalf of USIP for giving us such wonderful food for thought today. We're just very grateful to have you here. And I just have to tell you in front of this audience that you are one of my heroes in the peacebuilding field for having given of yourself to all of the world's troubles and the most difficult conflicts. You've looked into the eyes of some of the world's hardest people and made peace. And yet you've managed to keep your own sense of joy and compassion through all of that. And you've never ceased to give to our community, both as a friend, as a mentor to countless young people, as a champion for women in the field. We're just tremendously grateful for all of those things. So thank you.
Thank you.
And we ourselves bonded over conflict. I believe when we first met at the auditorium of the Wilson Center, we talked about Nagorno-Karabakh, and then served together on the intractable conflict panel. I think many of us were, I didn't find it masochistic, it was quite enjoyable.
That shows how seriously affected you are, because you enjoy it.
Attended some of the wonderful parties at your house. My husband still teases me that I almost knocked Justice Rehnquist down a flight of stairs in my haste to get to another part of the room. And so it's just wonderful to welcome you back to Washington. Thank you for all that you do.
Thank you.
And thank you for giving the opportunity to have some dialogue around some of the questions that you asked today, and also a couple that maybe we can explore further. So if we can start with an easy one. So you mentioned one triangle of no peace without human rights, no human rights without development, in that beautiful triangle. But here's another one, is what do we do about the tension between peace and justice? clearly both goals that we want to reach in any conflict. And yet in Darfur, where you mediated, perhaps even in Kenya, when there are indictments by the International Criminal Court, how do we think about weighing peace building and justice? Are those in fact a choice? Can we have both? But what is your experience as a mediator in trying to balance those?
Well, I think the fact that there is an international criminal court, to pick up that line of thought, plays a very important role as a deterrent in many situations. Sometimes I ask myself, are they really aware of the fact that they can be brought to the Hague for war crimes or crimes against humanity? But I'm told by many out there in the field that the fact that a commander of a force knows that when these atrocities have been committed, he is going to be on that list. So I think there is already a positive element in the preventive area. But I also must be very honest with you and say that there is a bit of a dilemma. I was mediating in the Darfur conflict, 2007 and 2008, and the prosecutor of the ICC, Ocampo, charged President Bashir, with not only war crimes and crimes against humanity, but also genocide. And when he charged him on genocide, this matter was turned, this was turned to a panel of 3 judges. I don't know if you are a lawyer, of course, you know, there's a panel to look into that. And then it turned out that the 3 lawyers came to the conclusion that yes, crimes against humanity are war crimes, but no, it's not enough. There is not enough evidence for genocide. So what happened was that Bashir could say to his colleagues in Africa, listen, when the real lawyers look at this, instead of this politicizing prosecutor, quotation mark, then it doesn't hold water. So he travels around and is being accepted. And Salim Salim and I, we were the co-negotiators, he for African Union and me for UN. We were more or less unemployed. We were not welcome. So the fact that this started meant that the political process was dead. For about 3 or 4 months, I think. We both resigned then and handed over to a joint mediator. But then I really came to the conclusion, yes, it does have sometimes a negative effect on the peace efforts. And that is just a fact of life. On the other one, since I myself, as former deputy minister of Sweden at that time, was fighting for this court in the negotiations in Rome, pushing it, then I say, well, that's the way it is. We have to do the 2 things. We have to do it in parallel, even if there is a price to be paid. But no, there is sometimes a contradiction, and you can see it now. How do we deal with the new leadership in Kenya and so forth, where you will have to weigh that right. But as long as the new president is cooperating with the court, I don't think he will be put on the banned list of banned, as it seems to be the conclusion of most. So, a dilemma.
Good. Well, thank you. And now I hope an easier question. If looking back over your career, what are some of the keys to success of a mediator?
Why don't you ask about keys of failure also?
I'm being optimistic, but you could certainly talk about failure. And we
actually,
heard this morning we should learn from our successes.
Actually, Peter Wallenstein, my colleague in Uppsala, who wrote a book, who came out here, if I may mention that, he wrote a book about my negotiations on Iran, Iraq, Sudan, Nagorno-Karabakh, Darfur, one more, 6 of them. And it came out here in November 2011. It's called The Go-Between. And he wanted me to be more systematic. He thought I was, too anecdotal and, So he found a pattern in my work which I never discovered myself. It was incredible. I'm really impressed by the academic world. But then he asked me exactly this question. Spend a weekend and think about your negotiations and try to identify what is the reason you failed and what is the reason you succeeded. He started with the failure. It's my masochistic nature. So I did that, and I came to 4 conclusions of failure or success in negotiations and mediation. And it goes pretty deep, I think, because it can be valid perhaps
for you in your life too, I hope. The first reason to fail or succeed in mediation is the word, the language. Peaceful settlement of disputes is word. If you look at your own life in this room, I promise you that 95% of you have the word as your main tool of work. The spoken word and the written word is your main tool. Do we pay enough attention to the value of every word? We don't. The nuances in negotiations, when you really have to come with the exact right nuance to either open the door or close the door. Hammarskjöld has a great quote. If you have no questions in the end, I have a quote in the pocket in the charter that I can read out, but I won't now, to not lose my thread. Second reason to fail or succeed is timing. In negotiations, when you fail, you either do it too late or too early. You have to choose exactly the right time. Well prepared, don't wait until it's too late, but don't jump it too early because then it may be consumed, denied, rejected, and then you can't come back to it often. You know that, Bill. Thirdly, cultural sensitivity. To put yourself in the clothes and the food and the shoes of the other side. Who are they? What is their background? What is their religion? What is their history? What are their culture? Where do they come from? What is their family situation? Who are the people around them? What is the power circle around them? You have to know this in and out. And then also be curious, be interested in culture, history, religion, tradition. Makes your life more interesting. If you come cold into these situations, you show contempt for the environment in which you come. And this is not only negotiations outside a country, it's also in the multicultural societies we have at home, something we should think about in our own countries also. And lastly, perhaps the most important thing, and I say that, I wouldn't have said it 20 years ago, personal relations and your own personality. The degree to which you can instill trust in people, even sympathy. And you know that in negotiations, there's often a very tense situation, nervousness. The other side runs the risk of making concessions. If you are to make them move, they have to trust you, that you are absolutely truthful and that they know that your word stands. And if you have established that confidence, so much is easier. And sometimes you could even try humor, sense of humor, but I would not advise you to do it. It's very dangerous. Humor is very culture sensitive. It varies from culture to culture. I've seen people tell something they think extraordinarily funny, and they are met with stone faces on the other side. But these four reasons, I think, the language and the timing and cultural sensitivity and personality and personal relations, that's where you find most of it.
I wonder if I could turn two of those questions on their head. And one of them is, I thought one of the best things about the Go-Between book was its discussion of the exit of mediators. We talk a lot in the field about ripeness and when a conflict is kind of ready to be mediated. We don't talk very much about when a mediator says, my role is done, or it's time for me to go. How have you thought about some of the exits in your own mediation work?
Well, Peter did that chapter based on how we exited from Darfur. It was Salim, African Union, and me. We decided in early June 2008 that we should leave. We had worked 1.5 years on it. And we took a decision, just the two of us, and then we designed a strategy. And that was that we together went to African Union's Peace and Security Council in Addis Ababa, which was very unusual that the UN negotiator accompanied the African Union negotiator. We delivered an absolutely coordinated message. He spoke for 20 minutes, I spoke for 10 to complement him. And we got full support for a very good line, tough line. I won't go through the substance. And then we went immediately thereafter, almost immediately a week later, to UN Security Council, where I had made sure that Salim Salim was at my side. I spoke 20 minutes, he spoke 10 minutes. And with the same message to the Security Council. By that, we had sort of delivered the present to our successor. And we also had worked out with the Secretary General of the UN and the chair of the African Union that we should have a joint mediator. So we had very good cooperation, never a difference between us. But we felt anyway that there was a risk that one would play out one against the other. So we identified together with some friends and colleagues the former foreign minister of, the foreign minister at that time, he changed, Bassolé of Burkina Faso, who by the way now plays a role in Mali, the Mali negotiations. And he became the joint mediator. And he had then the resolution from the African Union and from the UN Security Council as a good start. But what happened that summer was this complication with the ICC, Ocampo. So he had 3 or 4 months where nothing could be done. But he felt that was good time in preparations.
And the second part of that question is you talked about the necessity to develop trust and sympathy for the mediator. But how about for you as the mediator? How do you develop sympathy? How do you keep your neutrality when you're dealing with parties who've done some really unconscionable things?
That's a very good question. I can tell you my worst moment as a negotiator was 1989. We had finally got a ceasefire in the Iran-Iraq war. By the way, I was helping Prime Minister Palme, who was UN representative in the early 80s, to develop a formula for peace in the Iran-Iraq war. That formula was rejected by both sides in 1982. The peace came about, or the ceasefire came about in 1988, and that formula was strikingly similar to what we had suggested in 1982. And the difference is 600,000-700,000 people killed, and an enormous number of refugees, and deep distrust between Shia and Sunnis coming out of that conflict. But anyway, 88, then the resolution was taken 88. I don't know whether anyone would remember what happened on the 18th of March 1988 in the Kurdish areas. It was the Halabja, the use of chemical weapons against Halabja by Saddam Hussein and his foremost general, incredibly also called Chemical Ali, using chemical weapons against his own population. 5,000 people at least were killed by these horrible weapons. And I was asked to then go to Baghdad and Tehran and turn this Resolution 598 into a peace agreement. And that was the most difficult moment in my negotiated life, knowing that Saddam Hussein, who was sitting in front of me, was the one who had given the green light to sending chemical weapons into that population. But I must admit, I felt that, well, I had practiced for this job since 1980. I was one who really knew that to see. I was right in that negotiation. I had responsibility to make sure that war didn't erupt again. So I didn't bring this up. It wasn't part of my brief. So you have to exercise a tremendous self-discipline to maintain that neutrality, that they know that you are a professional, that you have to... I had Saddam Hussein on one side and the Iranian mullahs on the other side. Well, you can say what you like, but they are the ones that decide whether their people will die or not, whether their soldiers will die out there in the field. So you have to be really steel yourself in some situations. But I won't describe this as a big pain. I mean, it's a tremendous pleasure. I can tell. I really advise this profession. Doing mediation is wonderful when you sort of can get out of a situation and move things. I can tell you one example, if I may, of a fun thing after this Halabja story. This shows that diplomacy is often so practical. We brought them together first time in August 1988, the Iranians and Iraqis, and they hated each other without limits. We brought them to Geneva, and I'll just tell you about the first negotiation. We had to have walkie-talkies in both rooms beside the negotiation room so that they would enter the room at exactly the same second. None of them would ever accept that they would wait even 5 seconds for the other side. So we had 2 people with walkie-talkies say, now, and then they came into the room. When they first saw the room, this wasn't the occasion, this was the day before, we had a negotiation structure like this, you know. The UN was sitting there, Iran was sitting there, and Iraq was sitting there. And they said, both of them, never. Do you mean that we should face them? So we had to create a triangle like this. So that the UN was sitting here, Iran was sitting there, and Iraq was sitting there. So they didn't look at each other. They talked through us. Fine. The tables were there, came in second by second. Then they would never talk to each other apart from at this meeting. We kept on for a month or so. Preceding, secretary, went back to New York and left the negotiation to me. I was then personal representative for Iran Iraq. It was incredible. It was so tiresome. Anyway, they never talked to each other. But then we had an idea. We have to make them connect. There has to be personal relations. Personal relations have to develop. So we said to each other, Swiss coffee is very good. Strong Swiss coffee. So we placed a coffee table here. Here, exactly there. And then we started early, 8:30, and then we dragged on. Normally we had a break around 10, we waited, 10:15, 10:20, 10:30. Coffee was brought in, the brew of fresh, strong Swiss coffee. And we saw the Iraqis looking at that table. And then I said innocently, well, gentlemen, unfortunately, they were all men. I've never negotiated with a woman on the other side. It's horrible. Apropos Resolution 1325 of the UN Security Council. So I said, why don't we have a cup of coffee together? And they left thinking that they should do as they always do, went to their rooms, but then they felt that coffee taste. And I told them, by the way, on their way out, there's no coffee in your own office. It's here. So they turned around. That's where they met. And that's where we realized that one of them spoke Farsi in the Iraqi delegation, and a couple of others spoke Arabic. And then we brought them together, you know, like this. And then I had a joke which worked. After twice doing this, I identified 2 of the most open people. I'll give you the names later. Nasser Nasseri and what's his name? Kitani, Iraqis. I said to them, we should continue to meet more informally. You know, I live in the Hotel Intercontinental. You know what they have in the hotels? Yes, they have this continental breakfast. Then I say, tomorrow morning we will have confidential breakfast, the 3 of us.
Confidential. And
they went down, they probably had to ask Tehran and Baghdad. They got the permission for confidential breakfast in my room. But this is just, you know, it's so many illogical aspects of negotiation.
Well, as you know from your work, there's a tremendous passion among the next generation for peace building and conflict resolution. What advice would you give a young person who wants to start in this field?
Well, I think the first thing is, of course, to build on the question of language and words. To first of all, master your own language. Have 5 synonyms of everything that is needed, so that you can vary. So your own language is absolutely crucial. Of course, then I would advise every young person to at least learn 1 more language absolutely fluently. And I think in today's world, can choose Arabic, you can choose Chinese, but I would still say that French is extremely important. If you want to have a career in the UN or European Union, in my case, you have to speak French. It's absolutely
And for the record,
Spanish,
you're fluent in about 5.
well, thank you. Including Swedish, yes, 5. Thank you. Yeah. And then you exercise that curiosity. Go out and experience things outside your own country. It's hard. I meet so many brilliant young people who don't get the foot inside the door. I've been trying to help some, but it's very, very difficult. But if you can go out in the field to serve with an NGO or be a volunteer somewhere, just get out and have an experience. Go and try to get anything outside your own country. I have a dream. Sounds like Martin Luther King, but can you imagine what the world would look like if we made it mandatory that everyone who will get out of university on the master's level should have spent 4 to 6 months abroad? That it requires a 4 to 6 month stint abroad. But that is not going to be an enormously expensive proposition. That is based on programs, exchanges. The campuses are exchanged. I myself was an exchange student in America. It changed my life. As a 17-year-old boy, I was traveling around this country together with people from 22 nations in 2 buses. And went back to Europe by boat 9 days. And it was a mini UN. And you are so receptive when you're young. And you get this humility, which is so important. Seeing your own country from outside is so valuable. So that type of experience. And then, of course, choose studies you must have a general framework. You should be analytical and be able to write very well. You have to be able to write very well and speak very well to the point and all that. But then also to try to find a niche, something which is uniquely good to know. Well, for instance, if our political department, we need Arabic speakers in the Foreign Ministry of Sweden, I'll go back to that. You may choose, let's say, environment and refugees. You can choose a subject which, organized crime, which is understudied, which is not studied enough. Migration, which also needs a lot of analysis. These new phenomena that I mentioned, getting deeper into something which is, people would say, oh, this person has an interesting background, doing this is what we need. So these are just some ideas. But I really feel very much myself that I have a responsibility to hand over the baton to the next generation, because there is so much talent and there is so much aspiration and so much dreams about the future that are not fulfilled. The deeper issues, of course, one of the biggest problems in the world that I should have mentioned, but that's too much to bring into the room, is youth unemployment. It's an enormous danger. Look around the Mediterranean. You have approximately 40% unemployment on both sides of the Mediterranean, both north and south. What do these young people do? Stay with their mothers and fathers, no salary, feel worthless, no job. Do they trust their institutions? What direction do they go politically, left or right or down? It's a horrible problem. So this is, I think, something we need to work with a lot.
And finally, actually a request, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience. But I was very struck by what you said about the importance of institutions. Of course, with the World Bank report, that was one of its #1 recommendations. From the peace-building perspective, I find that very true, but that there's a big missing component, which is that institutions don't spring from a vacuum. The way you create institutions is through the kind of dialogue and consensus building and negotiation that we do in the peace-building field. And what I would ask from you and your United Nations colleagues is, especially in these very fragile environments in which we work, can we work together to support the kinds of difficult dialogue between governments, donors, civil society groups that create solid and sustainable institutions? And not to have the fiction that these are supposed to somehow arise magically, then all will be right with the world.
Absolutely. No, I think you're absolutely right. When I talked about the division of labor, the shared responsibility, I meant exactly this, that we need to connect with those who can indeed make a difference on the ground. The reason why the rule of law is also controversial in the negotiations is that it is by many countries considered exclusively an internal issue, an internal affairs. They don't think it's interference in internal affairs. What do you have to do with our institutions? So that's why you have to have a political dynamics that is being developed, both from the outside and inside the countries. And by that, you need to work with those who in the end will live with and support these institutions. So I think here's a very important role for organizations like yours. And I can already now promise, Pim, take note of this, that my head of rule of law unit, Edric Salus or Giovanni, could come down here and have a seminar with you on this. It would be very, very rewarding for them also. In fact, I can tell you something interesting. I don't think I told you. We are going to have a big day with at the spring meeting of the World Bank. Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon comes here, and I will be here on Thursday and Friday. We're going to have seminars on post-2015 development. We're going to have seminars on sanitation and water and financing of that. We are going to have a seminar on the rule of law. So that the World Bank also gives this priority, and we will do it. So, in fact, Edric Salus will be down here, will he not, Pim, on Friday? Why don't we ask him to stay for a couple of hours and discuss it with some of your team?
Well, if he would be willing to stay till Saturday, we are hosting a side meeting at the World Bank on the experience from the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States and what those processes can tell us about the post-2015 landscape.
That's very interesting.
So if he would like to come to that, we'd be delighted.
Yeah, well, he will. I will have to return to New York. But no, I think that's great. We should definitely do that. And I think the World Bank has made great progress on this. Their study on post-conflict situations is very important and was somewhat unexpected. But and this also means that we have a much stronger relationship now, UN and World Bank. The old Bretton Woods syndrome we had, they are so far away from us, but we are getting more closer and closer together now.
Well, thank you very much. And now, if it's okay, we'd like to open the floor.
Sure.
And we promise to have you out by 2:30.
Well, there's another session coming, isn't it, on Mali?
Yes.
Well,
yes.
you stop when it's time.
Okay.
I can stay. My train is at 4 o'clock.
Good. Why don't we start here with Charlie?
Take a couple of questions at one time.
Let's do that. Okay.
Not sure what to call you, Ambassador, Deputy Secretary, His Excellency.
Jan.
You spoke, we'll bring up Charlie Pillsbury with Mediators Beyond Borders, but I'm very interested in, again, the challenge of how you maintain neutrality and impartiality that you mentioned. And you mentioned two tracks, the standard track of peacekeeping and then I guess a more muscular track of peace enforcement. And I guess I'd like to raise up a third track, which is what kind of discussion or thinking has been going on about unarmed civilian peacekeeping initiatives in the UN.
Thank you. We'll take another one here.
Edward Joseph. I'm with Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I've had about 15 years experience in the field, and it's an honor to speak to you today, Mr. Ambassador, and likewise, Melanie, thank you so much for all you do. My question comes from 2 points that you raised in your very interesting remarks. One was those statistics you cited about the relapse into conflict, and the other, Mr. Ambassador, was the point you made about ownership. And my experience in the field is that, in fact, the ownership is one of the most commonly used and employed terms, and yet it's one of the most poorly misunderstood. And there are a number of examples where, in the name of ownership, outside actors who've been in a position to productively intervene have not done so, have said, no, 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 it's up to them, it's their process. And the result has been, I can give examples in Iraq, in the Balkans, in East Timor, and there are other examples. The result has been precisely the relapse into conflict that you spoke about. And so I was just wondering if perhaps you might be able to refine a little bit for this distinguished audience, the employment of the term ownership in peace building. Thank you so much.
And we had one more, yes?
Thank you, Your Excellency. I just want to comment or to give a background that there's a time that I asked you a question when I was quoting the UN Charter, and I quoted the wrong chapter. And you took out your charter in your pocket, and then you opened the exact chapter and corrected me, so I'll never forget that experience. That was 3 years ago. But just want to comment on your presentation when you were talking about how you and Chairperson Ahmed Salim were collaborative mediators, and you had this relationship that you consulted with each other. You even went to address the AU Peace and Security Council and then the UN Security Council together. That's a very typical example of co-mediation, which is very organic. But we find that in many cases, there's a multiplicity of mediators. There's what I can call mediator noise in one country, and each of them is doing their own different thing. Apart from the personal relational level, how can we ensure that mediators speak with each other, they collaborate, and they consult without necessarily causing confusion in the environment?
Thank you very much. Well, I think this is a very important tool which should be used more often, namely to have observers on the ground. There was an interesting example of observers in Macedonia back in the 90s, preventive deployment of observers. No, it was preventive deployment of troops, by the way. Before something has happened. But also, very often we should consider the importance of what I call international eyes and ears on the ground. That's one of the failures of Rwanda, was that we left and there were no international eyes and ears on the ground. Even a limited number of international eyes and ears can play a role. And we have through observer missions. Unfortunately, you may remember in the beginning of the Syria crisis, before this horror, which we now see in front of us, was there, we had actually observers in Syria. And regretfully, the Security Council called them back. I myself regretted that very deeply, because we need those observers on the ground. They were unarmed civilian observers. So I think this, you're right, this is a very important tool. And I see it also as a tool of prevention. One of my contributions to academic life is what I call a ladder of prevention, or where you have the different steps before you use of force. You have early warning, you have fact-finding missions before it happens, you have observers sent out, you have peacekeeping troops, and then you go up to the top of the ladder. Then you have sanctions, which is actually Chapter 7, and then you could build a pyramid to make sure it doesn't relapse again by reconciliation processes and development and so forth later on. So I would put that as a very important contribution that should be up for debate much more often. It's a good point. Thank you for making that. Yes, you're right. It's almost a banality, and I hesitated to mention the ownership. I'm tired of it. So if you can give me a new name, it's like good governance. What, do you have a suggestion? Responsibility. No, that's not precise enough. Well, shared responsibility, perhaps. But anyway, it's like good governance. I don't like good governance. What does it mean? Good governance is good institutions. Anyway, I think if you establish trust with the other side, and if you don't come with sort of, here I am, and I have all the solutions for you, and we in my country, I'm sorry, I probably did that today when I talked about Sweden. Anyway.
You're entitled.
Could I be excused for that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And you sort of show that cultural sensitivity that I talked about, and also think about number 4, personal relations. Then I think we should probably have a much more honest dialogue of the road ahead. I remember when I was working in politics, not in politics, but with politicians in the 70s and 80s. And we talked about cooperation with our partners in Africa in particular. And anything that smelled of interfering in their internal affairs was absolutely no-no. Oh no, we can just give budgetary support. We shouldn't say anything about women's rights, or we shouldn't say anything about democracy or environment later on. No, it was up to them to choose their own priorities. Then I met, when I was UN ambassador many years ago, an ambassador from one country who came to me and said, listen, I was a member of the opposition in my country. Now we are finally in power. But we would have wished that you had been clearer with us on human rights, on women, on environment, because that would have helped us in the opposition. So I said to myself, this is right, it's right. You have to have, and also, now I can speak with my friends from Africa. I'm really glad that I'm so accepted in the African group in the UN. I say also that you have to think of the fact that we are in austerity times. They are fighting for the budget I mean, we have to also respond to the taxpayers. Are these programs working or not? That's an obligation. You have to help us with that. So I think the more we take off, we really genuinely have a dialogue and talk about the problems, the better. I think we gain much more than that than just having generalities, putting that etiquette ownership up. Thank you for raising that question. I'm glad that I could prove that I really carry it. But this is, I'll tell you, probably 3 versions later. I change them about every 4 months or so. This one I cannot depart from, though. Pim Valdria knows why I can't leave this one. Because I was in the refugee reception centers in, what was it, Saida? No? In southern Lebanon. The Syrian refugees, 150,000 had come in December. They are 400,000 now. I was sitting there to get the sense of what it was like. So I sat when they did the interviews with or they told their stories. And I was sitting in a small room, and we were 15, 20 people in the room. And I was sitting crowded like this, and they were telling their stories. And I really felt that I wanted to write down what they're saying. And I felt my pockets, I had nothing to write on. The only thing that I had to write on was the charter. I've never written in the charter. Fortunately, I had a pencil, you see? What does it say? Syria refugees, December 8, 2012. Registration time too long. Medical care very expensive in Lebanon. Mother with 6 children. Harassed. Husband fled. Had to leave Syria during bombing. Lost everything. The children were kidnapped. Had to pay ransom to get them back. My son caught in a checkpoint, student boys forced into the army, now living with 2 families living in 1 room. This I tend to stick to this one because it's, to me, the charter and the realities in the world, charter and the child. But your question is several negotiators. And in the case of Salim and me, it's a real happy story. We are friends since many years, and actually there was never any problem between us 2. Sometimes our organizations could have difficulties, but he and I were absolutely best friends, and there was never a difference. But I have experienced something that we in the professional language call forum shopping. If there are 3 or 4 negotiating tracks, so people who get involved, then we really run the risk that one or both parties go to the other one and try to get the best part, and then, play that out against the other negotiators. So, in principle, you should not have several negotiators. In the beginning of the Iran-Iraq war, we had the non-aligned movement and the Organization of Islamic Countries, plus the UN, working in parallel, and it was really evident that the Iranians and Iraqis used that, and that's when I first noticed it. So you should, in principle, try to stop this. If it is there as a political fact, you have to force coordination and be pretty tough about it.
Well, Jan, we promised to have you done by 2:30, and it's 2:33.
Okay.
So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, and also, Rob, can you hand me that bag? Present you with just a small token of our affection and appreciation from the Alliance for Peacebuilding. And to just reiterate that you always have a home here with us, and we hope we can welcome you again in the very near future.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.